Okay. Well, good evening. I'm going to take this off. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for being with us tonight. I'm David Kahn, the director of the Adirondack Experience, and this is our first in-person event of the season. So we're really excited to our program series, Art and Inspiration in the Wild, comes from the name of that we're going to open this coming July 1, 2023. That is going to feature our art collection, which has been hidden away for a long time. This will be the first permanent exhibit of the collection to be exhibited, and we've been doing a series of programs live and online, I don't know, almost a year now. About see the show this year. It's going to have all the greats in them: A.F. Tate, Wells Prentice, William Charles Richard, Preston, Rockwell Kent, and of course Homer, who we're going to hear about this evening. And in looking around the gallery, I see many very generous people who have helped to support this wonderful exhibit that's going to open next year. So thank you all very much. And for those who might be interested, there are still galleries and paintings looking for names. So if you'd like to see me afterwards, I'd be happy to tell you all about it. It's a real opportunity. A few housekeeping notes first. There are bathrooms over there to your right, and in the unlikely event of an emergency, if you'd please use either the door you came in or the two doors at the rear of the auditorium to exit. That would be great. And this program will be available online within 24 hours or so. We're recording it this evening. Before proceeding any further, I do want to mention that the Adirondack Experience is located on the traditional lands of the Mohawk and Abenaki communities, and that Indigenous people continue to live in this region and practice their teaching and life ways. Tonight's program is dedicated to the memory of John Collins, a friend of the museum's, a former director, a former trustee. John was a beloved member of the Blue Mountain Lake community and the entire Adirondack community, for that matter. And we're honored to recognize his deep commitment to the museum and to the region with tonight's presentation. Afterwards, we're going to have a little reception over in the Visitor Center, a dessert reception in John's honor, and I hope you'll all join us for that. Now, for the star of this evening's program, I'm delighted to introduce Homer scholar and author William Cross. Bill's book, Winslow Homer, American Passage, is just out. In 2019, Bill curated Homer at the Beach, a marine painter's journey from 1869 to 1880, an exhibition that was at the Cape Ann Museum in Gloucester, Mass. Bill is a graduate of Yale and received his MBA from Harvard. And he's going to be speaking to us this evening about Winslow Homer's Adirondack discovery, and he'll discuss the ways in which the Adirondack became a place of salvation for Homer, as well as for many people today. So, Bill, please.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me? All right. And I am sure that I'm forgetting the names of others who had a hand in putting this together. But thank you all for being a part of this, and to all of you for coming. It's very meaningful for me to return here. I spent many, many happy hours as a child on this museum campus, and particularly admired the museum's founder, Harold Hochschild. He was a hero to me as a boy. He's a hero to me today, and this museum, as an example of how to enrich a sense of meaning and purpose about a place, is a remarkable witness, not just to me, but to the whole country. It is an American treasure, and you're so right to support it and to further its development on the foundation that Harold laid. It's an honor for me tonight to tread the trail that he blazed. You know Homer's Adirondack work very well, I suspect, and this will be my main topic, but I want to put that work in a broader context, the context of Homer's life. And in examining that life and the breadth of art that Homer made, I hope that you may find resonance not only with the Adirondacks, but also with other aspects of your life and your times, our times today. Homer's engagement with the Adirondacks is rooted in his youth far from this region and in his understanding of the red-hot drama by which our country was forged before, during, and immediately after the Civil War. Born in Boston to parents immersed in seaborne trade, even as a child, Homer was keenly aware of the economic, social, and moral tensions roiling the country, ranging from the Panic of 1837, a year after his birth, and arguably the first global financial crisis, to accelerating antebellum division over the greatest moral question of the day, slavery. The house in which Homer was born in the waning years of the Jackson presidency is long since razed, but was set amid the clutter and stench of Boston's North End, adjacent to wharves where Homer's father, an aspiring but failed merchant inventor, sought in vain to find his fortune. The Boston Homer knew as a child was hub to trade with ports across the whole Atlantic world, beginning with the southern states of the U.S., most importantly for the Homer family, Mobile, Alabama, where 3 of Homer's 6 paternal uncles settled, 2 of them permanently. Exactly 1 year before Homer's birth, one of those uncles, whom he knew well, was shipwrecked on the Bahamian island of Eleuthera. Years later, in 1885, as Homer first made pencil drawings and watercolors leading toward the Gulf Stream, perhaps Homer's greatest picture and the focus of the current exhibition at the Met, Run, Do Not Walk to see it before it closes July 31st, he and his father would return to the site of that wreck. While his precocious older brother Charlie, a brilliant chemist, attended Harvard, Winslow and his younger brother Arthur studied nearby at Cambridge's Washington Grammar School. Winslow appears to have dropped out to begin work by the summer of 1853, just after he turned 17. His boss was a Boston lithographer, John Henry Buford, whose downtown crossing workshop depended both on plentiful capital for presses and costly limestone blocks and on plentiful labor. Buford hired apprentices for 3 purposes: to grind down the blocks, to draw appealing designs on them, and then to print the finished products, from sheet music to theater tickets to book illustrations. 2 of those 3 purposes, grinding and printing, required fewer brains than brawn. But the middle one, drawing in crayon on limestone, necessitated both long hours and delicate skill as a draftsman. The slender, reserved Homer had that skill and that dedication and the encouragement of his mother, who was herself a talented amateur painter. About 9 months into his apprenticeship for Buford, another boy arrived in downtown Boston, working in a shop not far from Homer's birthplace in the North End. Similar in age to Homer, but from Virginia. His name, Anthony Burns, soon became famous, not only in Boston, but across the nation. Burns had escaped slavery by clambering aboard a ship bound for Boston. The man who claimed ownership of him hired a so-called slave catcher, Burns, and delivered him to a waiting U.S. courthouse steps. There, with the approval of the mayor and the president of the United States, young Burns was tried for violation of the Fugitive Slave Act. The brilliant oratory of his Harvard-trained counsel, Richard Henry Dana, who lived a stone's throw from Homer, failed to persuade the court. In chains, Burns was marched down the street for the eyes of 50,000 people. 1/3 of Boston's population. The site and the story were catalytic. Prosperous merchants, even in the textile industry, which depended on Southern cotton, would reflect, as one wrote, that we went to bed one night old-fashioned, conservative, compromise Union Whigs and waked up stark, mad abolitionists. The naked question emerged. In fulfilling the demand of the man who claimed he owned Burns, had the United States itself inflicted a crime, both against one teenage boy and against the core of its own ideals? Homer leaves us no documents telling us what he thought of Burns's trial or what he said of it to his neighbor, the lawyer Dana, author of 2 Years Before the Mast. But in 1856, as the nation's temperature continued to rise, he composed a lithograph depicting another act of violence, this time on the floor of the United States Senate. There, shortly after Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered his speech, The Crime Against Kansas, Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina, beat him. Across the print's top, Homer ran a quote from Brooklyn's Henry Ward Beecher, whose brother had been pastor to Winslow's mother at Boston's Park Street Church. The symbol of the North is the pen. The symbol of the South is the bludgeon. And then Homer began to design engravings for illustrated, a medium just 15 years earlier, and had now come to America. His designs were distinctive in their rhythmic geometry, humor, and suspenseful narrative ambiguity. In this case, for example, he's embedding a gentle spirit of abolitionist interest because the store is operated by one of Boston's leading abolitionists. He's purposely slowing down this watering cart intended to suppress dust on Boston streets by positioning it there in front of that store. At 23, Homer moved to New York, where several of Boston's other draftsmen had also moved, and where, accepting field trips along the eastern seaboard states and 2 long trips to Europe, he lived for the following 24 years. New York offered far better education for ambitious artists than Boston did, and taught Homer a geometric discipline that remained with him all his life, as is evident in this scored sketch made about 6 years before he died, and which gives an indication of the precision of his artistic process, as we will see in his Adirondack watercolors. New York grounded Homer in a practice of shaping visual narrative that he deployed across each medium within which he worked, from painting on canvas or wove paper or ceramic tile, to designing wood engravings, to etching and lithography. That practice remained core to his artistic methodology throughout his career. One example is this early watercolor, in which Homer places himself with 2 actors, each a brook trout, just above the line of water in which they swim. He is invisible, as we, the viewers, are, but still present, ushered together into an intimate drama. One trout is leapt, arced, clear out of its element. The unseen but expert fisherman has already acted. He first enraptured the fish with his blood-red fly, and then firmly hooked him. Now, in flying fully airborne, the trout takes center stage. It seeks to shake free of the fly, but also, unknowing, tangles with blue fly hanging as a dropper. The behavior of each aquatic actor matters both to themselves and to each other. Homer leaves the destiny of the second trout a matter of suspense. He conjures a narrative of ambiguity in which the viewer places himself in empathy with these living creatures on the cusp. Will they, too, perish? At 25, Homer had already found ways to direct his talent to tell a story without words and even without visible human characters, and to compel his viewers to care about the outcome of his tale. By the time Homer made that watercolor, his countrymen were already at war, killing one another in the bloodiest conflict of our nation's history. The brash brothers who published the illustrated newspaper Harper's Weekly needed draftsmen with narrative skill such as Homer possessed, and snapped up his designs. He bore witness to the everyday, often mundane story of war, the life of the ordinary foot soldier, not the general, offering complex but accessible compositions that connected the men at the front to lives back home. He opens his narrative for the viewer to imagine the varied experiences of those men and to consider the outcome of the story Homer begins. In News from the War, for example, Homer tells a story of news traveling by letter, conversation, or even the sound of a bugle. He hangs 7 scenes from telegraph wires, tightly integrating them thematically and visually. The device pays sly homage to the university building on the square, into which Homer himself had just moved, and where wires still dangled from the ceilings on which Samuel Morse had hung them 20 years earlier for his successful experiment inventing the telegraph. Homer could sell a design such as News from the War for about the equivalent of $2,700 today. In those days, the value of an oil painting like this was similar. But Homer aspired to become more than an illustrator. He wanted to be a painter, and for that, he needed to paint. With his success designing illustrations of life in camp, he turned naturally to that same subject in his first canvases. He chose the title with considerable care, Home Sweet Home. A man of few words, his titles were often as multivalent as his pictures. The subject of home permeated the Civil War for all those who had a stake in it. The enslaved who had no home, the Confederates who believed that only through secession could they retain their home, and the federal troops who fought ultimately for a larger mission, a reimagined home, an America anointed by God for his purposes. For most of each year, Homer's life in the 1860s and 70s was an urban one, dominated by the Century Association, the hub of his social and commercial life. For 45 years, from his election to membership in 1865 to his death in 1910, the club was Homer's primary and indispensable source of companionship and counsel, both artistic counsel and commercial counsel. Homer could sell his illustrations year-round, but he and other New York painters operated within a seasonal pattern each year. For example, traveling in the late spring and summer to scenic regions where they could make field sketches, then returning in the fall to their New York studios to make oil paintings based on those sketches, which they sold to deadlines the art market set. Each year, the first 4 months were exhibition season, and therefore also the season for auctions, at which they sold their work in the absence of the gallery system, which would begin to develop by the end of the 1870s. In dialogue with those friends, Homer further developed his painting methodology, about which he gave rare but suggestive hints, such as, "When I have selected the thing carefully," he wrote, "I paint it exactly as it appears." That is, Homer considered his context deliberately, constructed his frame as precisely as he set the objects within it, and then, and only then, expressed what he observed. Within the frame that Homer set, he painted with exactitude not a cartographic reality, but the truthful appearance to him. The son of one inventor and the brother of another, more successful inventor, he was intrigued with the emerging science of seeing, from optical physics to ophthalmology to photography, as this picture indicates. It's based on his time staying with a painter friend in a picturesque Catskills Valley. As I said, Homer left us few clues to his methodology, But in this case, a stereograph survives in a regional archive, which shows us what he chose to include in his picture and what instead he framed out. The comparison of Homer's painting with the stereograph leaves little doubt that his production of the canvas in his New York studio depended not only on the abundant field sketches he made, most of which are lost, but on this photograph, made not by him, but by an entrepreneur who sold souvenirs to tourists. Other evidence of Homer's use of photography in his creation of fine art may yet emerge, but this is the first. The Adirondacks, which Homer first visited in 1870, was one of those scenic regions to which, like the Catskills about the same time, he journeyed with painter friends. An unlikely evangelist, William Henry Harrison Murray, pastor of Boston's Park Street Church, was just then extolling the Adirondacks' attractions with a special fervor. His book, published the previous year, 1869, attracted such hordes of urban visitors that about the time Homer came here himself for the first time in 1870, a magazine was already satirizing the phenomenon with an illustration depicting a hapless fisherman who drowns as his hat, decorated with trout flies, floats away from him and attracts rill flies. Above him, an owl, an antlered deer, and a pair of bullfrogs dutifully study Murray's commentary on their dominion, which a sharp-clawed panther holds open for their perusal. Homer had little interest in joining those crowds, and instead made the challenging journey to a Minerva, New York clearing, then the farm of the Thomas Baker family, which took in boarders, including two painter friends of his, one of whom, Eliphalet Terry, had been coming as a guest for as many as 13 years. And this is in the collection here, a depiction of the early buildings on the clearing. The other friend was John Lee Fitch, who, like Homer, was a member of the three-man art committee at the Century Association. Fitch and Terry shared with Homer his passion for fishing, to which the Baker farm was ideally suited. Although Homer made at least 2 oil paintings based on that visit, his principal purpose was probably to gather sketches. It is interesting that in this oil painting you see a jacklight in the stern. So there is a narrative element here, and the cross made by the branch there is an interesting piece of this too. So his principal purpose was to gather sketches that he could then sell as illustrations. He did that immediately upon his return to New York. He found a customer, not at Harper's, but at an illustrated children's magazine, or children's newspaper, which bought 3 wood engravings from him. That first visit of 3 months to the Adirondacks allowed him to see the area around the Baker farm, not only in the late summer, but also over the fall hunting season, during which that year an unexpectedly early snowfall occurred. And then as loggers made use of that weather in their felling trees near the icy Hudson. When Homer returned for his second visit to the Adirondacks in 1874, a major change had occurred in his artistic and commercial life. In January that year, for the first time, and to some acclaim, he had exhibited a suite of watercolors, which he'd made in Gloucester the previous summer. On that second visit, he did sell 2 illustrations to Harper's, and in the case of the second one, used the same design both for a watercolor and for a larger oil painting. Homer also made that year an unusual portrait of his friend Terry with a Springer Spaniel who invokes a narrative component to the picture, as it's bred for birding, not fishing. Given Terry's precarious position in the Adirondack guideboat and the breed's excitable nature, the calm of this quiet fishing expedition may be short-lived. Homer's wordy title, The Painter Eliphalet Terry Fishing from a Boat, seems to assert the artistic status of the older man, whose wealth exceeded his recognition among either collectors or critics. Terry's father of the same name had founded the Hartford Fire Insurance Company. To survive, Homer needed to sell his work. Terry did not. In a gesture of friendship, Homer gave the watercolor to the Century Club, of which they were both members. He was also sharing a private joke about Terry's ill-suited companion in the guideboat. The resourceful Homer found a way to earn a return from the design in another form, creating an oil painting the following year that's based on the portrait of his friend. Curiously, Homer's third visit to the Adirondacks was not to the Baker farm, but to Keene Valley, again with painter friends. He exhibited this picture in the fall of 1877, but hid that fact when it remained in his inventory unsold 3 years later. He wanted to exhibit it at the prestigious National Academy Annual, which permitted only previously unexhibited fresh work. So he just painted in a fresh date, 1880. Ever resourceful. He clearly admired the more rugged terrain of the High Peaks region and reflected that admiration not only in this depiction of 4 enterprising women hikers, but also in a wood engraving he made for a special gift edition of Longfellow's poem Excelsior. And when it came to making perhaps his greatest Adirondack painting, he began very inauspiciously with a clumsy depiction of 2 of his 4 female hikers, now paired with a highly recognizable Adirondack character, Orson Old Mountain Phelps. Now in his 60s, Phelps was no longer a guide, but a self-appointed seer on any topic tourists in Keene Valley might raise with him, especially if they seemed likely to purchase one of the pack baskets he made upon the completion of the conversation. Homer placed him and a younger man, also not a guide, in an Adirondack landscape Homer knew far better than his models did. In Two Guides, Orson points precisely due west from a hill near the Baker farm to Blue Mountain, perhaps in homage to his hero, Horace Greeley, whose motto was, "Go west, young man, go west." The young man with Orson, Monroe Holt, once a woodsman, was now a hotel keeper in the heart of Keene Valley, working with his wife, an excellent cook, who embroidered on his red shirt a heart, reflecting their rootedness around their big hearth. In Homer's painting, Monroe follows Orson's direction with his eye, but not his feet. The 2 figures strike a contrast by age, height, and personality. They allude to polarities we all feel between our American itch and our longing for home. Despite his affection for the Baker farm and the strength of this picture and others he made in the Adirondacks, Homer did not return to the region until 1889. Over those dozen years, he and his 2 brothers and their parents initiated a major new phase in the Homer family's life, and especially in his. The family bought a large chunk of Prout's Neck, a 150-acre promontory a dozen miles south of Portland, Maine, and Winslow remodeled a stable to become his home and studio. His first years at Prout's were ones of staggering productivity. Homer focused for the first time in his paintings on the innate longing of all people for salvation, and on a theme that would engage him for another 2 decades of mid-ocean wreck and rescue, due in part perhaps to stories he heard on the deck of the Cunard steamship Parthia on his way to England, and perhaps reflecting the death of his mother just after his triumphant sale of this picture for the then staggering sum of $2,500, equal to more than $65,000 today. He also made his first trip to the tropics, traveling with his widowed father to the Bahamas, the winter following his mother's death. The drawings and watercolors, including this one, he made that winter, led ultimately to his monumental work, the Gulf Stream. As mortal themes became central to his labors, Homer created the famous contrasting pendants of the herring net and the fog warning, in which he sets a fruitful harvest of small fish that a pair of men catch close to shore against an uncertain outcome, as a solitary figure pursues large fish far out at sea, at potential loss to his own life. But Homer's period of immense productivity in the mid-1880s led to a slump, which deepened to a depression. His pivot was through returning in 1889 to the Adirondacks and to what had been the Baker Farm, now the newly formed and rustic North Woods Club, of which he became a member. At and around the club, Homer found conviction that the words of his favorite author and Anglo-Scots physician were true. Everything bears the mark of order, impressed upon it by the almighty hand. Homer's newfound delight in God's created world in which he immersed himself was as tangible as the trout he painted. He sees in awe the working out of an invisible but benevolent design. He probably shared with Pastor Murray the contrarian view that in the Adirondacks, with such symbols and manifestations of God around, you need not go to the lettered page to learn of him. The Bible with its print and paper is a hindrance rather than a help. The trout have sprung from the rippled, nurturing shallows for a brief moment, just as has their prey. Homer catches all of it in mysteriously ordered balance. The fish, the bug, the lily pads, and the air he too breathes. He relishes the suspense of the moment and its extreme brevity for the three characters in his drama. Homer's confidence in the balance he observed is visible in the underlying order of his own work, which is more disciplined than at first it may appear. In this watercolor here at the museum, for example, the fulcrum of his composition is precisely on the brightest spot of a twisting line, as a fisherman seeks to capitalize on the rise at right. And the horizontal center line runs right over the hair of his head. Homer also found congenial companionship at the club and depicts several of his fellow members as they fish, including a single fisherman casting in Mink Pond Outlet with a muscular pose, half sitting, half standing. He courts more danger than he knows. The confused mass of squared boulders is more slippery than it looks. A massive stone, its edge lit in red, like the man's belt, hides all his left leg but his thigh, as if it's already broken his bone. The stone at dead center hangs like a pink-tinged, glistening anvil over the puddles of red in the basin below. In the Adirondacks, Homer found the emotional resources to embrace daring color harmonies and subject matter. We spoke at earlier today, a few of us talked about the tremendous danger embedded in the logging industry, and this is not something that would have drawn many other painters in this period, but it drew Homer. He returned that year for a second stay in hunting season, and made several watercolors with a dazzling display of autumn colors. One of them is another excellent case in which Homer's disciplined compositional methodology creates a sense of balance we comprehend intuitively and is in fact the creation of his meticulous geometric harmony. His comfort in the Adirondacks on his return trips in 1891 and 1892 emerges in his loose brushwork and in the almost surreal perspective of his horizonless watercolor Mink Pond, within which he seems to be at, below, and above the waterline all at the same time. His cloud studies reflect his close observation of the ever-changing weather and of the men working on this land and water, often at significant risk to their lives. In one case, Homer's eye falls upon a logger who is himself observing closely and, like Homer, seeking to be unseen by the deer on the far side of the river. Homer took special interest in depicting his friend, the bearded guide Rufus Wallace, then 62, and a local farm laborer, the 20-year-old Michael Francis Flynn. Their pairing on land and on water gave Homer several opportunities to contrast their differences. But Homer also relished their individual characteristics, the consciously vulnerable old man and the young invincible, who has yet to discover that he too is mortal. In both his watercolors and his titles and inscriptions, Homer showed an empathy with the deer he and other members hunted, from the interrupted tete-a-tete to its aftermath administered at the hand of man, and finally what he likely called just shot. It's the younger model, Flynn, who stars in his only 2 North Woods Club oils. In one, Flynn seems to exercise grim control over the landscape around him with its prominent stumps and bloodthirsty dogs. Despite its tenor, this picture sold quickly, but the second, set in a pond, did not. His model looks toward the dog in anxiety that the balance of man, boat, and deer will be a brief one. After a hiatus of 2 years, Homer returned to the club in 1894 for his shortest stay of only 5 days. The previous year, he'd taken his farthest trip west to Chicago for the World's Columbian Exposition and journeyed north to Quebec, likely for the first time. His Adirondack visit that summer included an intriguing watercolor he titled, unusually, at lower right, Indian Village, Adirondacks, which several people over the course of the last week have noticed includes what seems to be Snowy Mountain in the distance. If anybody can identify the body of water in the foreground, which has stumped me and many others, please come up to me afterwards. In any event, the watercolor reflects Homer's emerging interest in the indigenous people of our continent, some of whom he found not here, but around Lake St. John in Quebec. He saw himself in them, perhaps, as outsiders making their way on soil and water they cherished and which their ancestors had known for centuries. Likewise, the rapids he observed in the Adirondacks pale by comparison to the grand discharge of Quebec's Lake St. John into the Saguenay River. While he continued to come to this special region to fish, including in black fly season, the more dramatic sport in Quebec fascinated him and made for compelling artistic subject matter, as did the unique characteristics of the enormous landlocked salmon he found there. The leaping Wananiche is, as his guidebook said, a beautiful fish to look upon, the strongest and hardest fighter, one that tests the tackle and skill of the angler to the fullest extent. In total, the king of freshwater fish. Several of the few watercolors Homer made here in the Adirondacks in his last summers reflect the surreal quality of the Canadian fish. And one in particular with a bass strangely suspended in the air above Mink Pond, with Beaver Mountain silhouetted against the horizon at sunset, seems related as well to his interest in fish taxidermy. His final Adirondack watercolor has the gravity of a man facing his mortality. So does what is perhaps his very last painting, set in Quebec. The unfinished picture includes a figure at center who bears a startling resemblance to Homer's closest friend, his oldest brother, Charlie. Not as he was then, sagging, slowing, shrinking, but as a sport in the prime of life, confident and engaged with the beauty and drama around him. The picture is Homer's last journey into his past as he looked to his future, an expression of the exultation he felt as witness to the powerful forces of nature. In its incomplete state, it makes even more room for the viewer to possess the tale and to imagine the ending. By these final years, Homer had long since won a reputation for work whose visual significance to our culture is comparable to the contributions that Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, and Mark Twain made in literature. Despite the recognition his work received, Homer's life changed little. Over all that life, in his close observation, his skillful hand, idiosyncratic faith, and tender heart for all he encountered, Homer practiced the principles he learned in his youth. He wrote that the life that I have chosen gives me my full hours of enjoyment for the balance of my life. The sun will not rise or set without my notice and thanks. On behalf of myself and this gentleman, thank you for coming. And I welcome your questions, and if you'll forgive me, I'm going to repeat them for the benefit of those who may watch the recording of this session. And also it helps me make sure I'm understanding your question correctly. So who has the first question? And if nobody raises their hand, I'm going to call on you. Yes?
Given the volume of art that he created, did he paint very quickly?
He was rapid in making his watercolors, not as rapid as he would like to have been perceived as. But the question was, how fast did the man paint? His watercolors were significantly more rapid than his oil paintings. And sometimes his oil paintings were marinating in his mind for years and years. As an example, the Gulf Stream, the tropical picture of the demasted sailboat with the sharks circling it, was something that he worked on for 14 years before he first exhibited it. And then over the following 7 years, while it remained unsold, he continued to tinker with it. He didn't use the word tinker, that's my word. His word was rework. And so the oil paintings were laborious. And they were laborious because the process can be long, but also because he regarded them as the more durable of his legacy, the pieces of his legacy. But he had a facility in drawing that goes back to his formation as an illustrator, and that gave him an ability to do watercolors quickly and start those watercolors really as colored drawings. Does that help? Yeah. Great. Yes?
Can you speak a little bit about the art market reception to him, both while he was alive and after his death?
Yes. So what was the art market's response to Homer? Until 1866, when he exhibited Prisoners from the Front, which is a meditation on the meaning of the Civil War. He was recognized as being a painter to follow, but not viewed as all that much more important than anybody else. Prisoners from the Front changed that, and for 10 years after that, so until 1876, the centennial year, it was the standard against which everything else was judged and found lacking. And the principal complaints about Homer's work were that it was too sketchy and that he was leaving too many questions unanswered, that there were sort of dangling elements to his works of art, which of course is part of why we love the work, that he does have this multivalent character. That ambiguity is part of why we're drawn to it. And we're less fond today of academic paintings. When you go to the Clark, you may want to spend more time with the Renoirs than with the Bouguereaus, for example. And so our eyes have changed too. But during that period, the market valued more finished academic art, both European and American. Over time, the market did move towards understanding that he left his paintings in the, quote, sketchy state that he left them in, because that allowed room for the viewer to be engaged in them. And there was an epiphany that occurred after he came back from England, where he spent 20 months in the early 1880s, and a recognition that the large watercolors he made there and about that, that period, even after he'd returned, were monumental in a way that, that warranted their being taken seriously, even though they were watercolors rather than oil paintings. So was Homer ever a starving artist, unappreciated? No. And he had illustration as the bedrock for him, which he gave up in terms of illustrating for newspapers only in 1875, once he had established a secure way to make a living through his watercolors, even if oil paintings took a long time. So by the time George Inness died in 1894, George Inness being the most admired American painter up until his death, by that time, Homer was ready to assume that mantle. Hope that's a comprehensive answer. Yes?
This is a funny question. Maybe you can help me out. Was the Homer that you met as you worked on your book different from the Homer you knew going into it?
Yeah, great question. Did the process of writing this book introduce me to a person who surprised me in the differences? And this may require a longer answer than you might imagine. This is my second Homer project. The first is the one that David mentioned, which was working as curator of an exhibition on the formation of Homer as a marine painter, which I did in 2019. I mean, that was a multi-year project, but the exhibition was in 2019. And that enabled me to understand the shaping of the man over an 11-year period, 1869 to 1880, from his first marine painting through the most productive summer of his life, which was in Gloucester before going to England. And he did evolve over that period, but it was only 11 years. So over the 74 years, cradle to grave, of the man's life as I learned it in writing this biography, I learned a lot about his life prior to that, and particularly about the significance of his family circumstances and the connection to trade, particularly trade between Boston and the South, which I realized was very foundational for him, and gave him a set of allegiances that were as complex as the fabric of American society. It was a system. We all were engaged in it, regardless of where we put our heads at night. And he understood that. And so that was one thing that I came to understand about Homer. A second thing I came to understand is that he was very much immersed in his world, including in the period of applied science, which was an exciting aspect of life then. As the son of an inventor and the brother of an inventor, Homer was really interested in all of these elements of science, particularly the science of seeing and how we perceive, that I had no idea about before I wrote this book. And there's an object lesson, there's several object lessons here, but one of them is to slow down, as we've all been compelled to do in COVID, and learn about things that we didn't know we might be interested in, and learn from people who are different from us. So I've seen in him an evangelist for looking longer, looking deeper, looking broader, benefiting from the perspectives of people who are different than I am. And that's one of the things that has surprised me about this friend I've made who died 112 years ago. Huntley.
You know, I'm observing, this is an observation I want to ask if it's accurate or not. But it seems to me that his watercolors in the Adirondack, the very medium of watercolors requires you to move quickly, because if you're doing wet on wet or dry on, you know, it dries quickly, it moves quickly. But there seems to have been, when he was here doing those, a sense of release, of letting go, that was happening in the medium as well as in the subject matter, in comparison to the oils, which you say were so thoughtful and so long to do, that there was this sense of just being able to let go and be simply present to whatever was being invited to him by the environment that he was in. It seemed to be a way of rejuvenating his spirit. Now, am I accurate about that, or was it just something that I was perceiving through the talk?
So if I can summarize Huntley's excellent question, was Homer, through the medium of watercolor, working in a more relaxed way than he was in oil? And I think the answer is yes, and particularly at the North Woods Club. It was a place where he really did relax, and relaxed both because of his immersion in this beautiful, unspoiled, created world, which he perceived as having an underlying order that he reflected in his work, and also because of the people there. You know, relatively few of the people are recognizable, but he had a small group of friends that he could really let his hair down with, and it made a big difference to him. And you know, the Northwoods Club today is, as it was then, a place that doesn't put on a lot of pretension, and people, it self-selects. The people that want to be there are not the people that want to dress up at night and have lots of fancy parties. That's not the nature of the place. And it wasn't what he wanted. He was a very formal, reserved person, but he needed to break from that. And that was a place where he could do that. And you see it in his art.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, Kim.
You said he had that small group of friends. It never appears that he was interested in getting married or settling with a family like that.
So if I'm hearing it right, the question is, what about his personal life? Did he fall in love? Was he interested in having a family life? And I think the short answer is that he was not only reserved, but he was responsible. And he recognized that with a somewhat volatile income as an artist, It would be difficult for him to be an especially responsible husband. It would also be difficult for him to let his hair down with a wife. The reserve was problematic, I think, for his being as vulnerable as any spouse is in a marriage. We don't know a lot about who he fell in love with. I've been careful to say things only when I feel there's evidence for them. My guess, though, is my speculation, is that he probably never consummated a sexual relationship with either man or woman, that he was reserved enough that it was just a bridge too far. He poured his emotion into his work. But it's hard to know for sure. Yes, ma'am.
You talked a lot about the social influences on him and about him socially. But what about the artistic influences on him? In the beginning, he seems to have been influenced by the Hudson River School. Then later, he becomes more dynamic, like Cuyabut. What was he exposed to? Who did he study? What was the influence of the Century Club, and what was the influence of the time he spent in England?
Right. So if I can summarize, in addition to social influences, what were the principal artistic influences? And there's quite a bit about that in the book, which I didn't include in the talk tonight. But the short version is that when he moved from Boston to New York, his one and only teacher, a relatively obscure French painter named Frederic Rondel, who'd also moved to the U.S., also moved to New York and from Boston. And Rondel gave him some instruction. He also took classes under Thomas Cummings through the National Academy. But he was largely self-taught. Those were classes that he took for relatively brief periods. He didn't go to Paris and work in Thomas Couture's studio. He didn't apprentice with another painter in the US. His training was as an illustrator who aspired to paint and who was generally teaching himself the art skills. But he looked a lot. And he was in a place where, even before the Met was founded, there was art to be found in private collectors' homes. And by joining the Century, he had a lot more access to those works of art, including works by Turner and Constable and Barbizon painters. He had access to those works here. We can guess about some of what he might have seen, but there weren't that many places to go, and the world was smaller then, so we can guess what he was seeing. And then he had an opportunity in late 1866 to travel first to England, then to France. And he shows up in England just as a fellow American about his own age was returning from another overseas trip, and his name was Whistler. And he was a marketer and brought with him these amazing seascapes from Valparaiso, Chile. And it's inconceivable that Homer wouldn't have seen those while he was there. Then he goes to Paris, and not only is the exposition on, but also Courbet and Monet have their shows up at the same time. He's seeing that work too.
That's what it looked like.
Yeah. So, and then he's coming back to the U.S., bringing all that in mind. And so I spend a fair amount of time in the book on that, but it's a great question. And I'm guessing that there's a hook coming.
That's right.
Do we have time for one last question, or should we call it at that?
We'll take
One more. Is there one last question? Yes. Peter, thank you.
As his followers,
Great question. The question is, who is best named as a follower? And I have to say, I think that his legacy is very significant for everybody in American art. But one name that I'm afraid there's no connection I know of to the Adirondacks, but one name is George Bellows, who I think was much inspired by Homer. Closer to the Adirondacks, Rockwell Kent was as well, and certainly Andrew Wyeth was, and there's also obviously a Maine connection there. But he casts such a long shadow that even contemporary artists today, if you sit down with them and get them to talk honestly, they'll often speak to the ways in which Homer has shaped them. Kehinde Wiley, for example. I think we are all as Americans right to think of him as a visual artist in the context of the giants of the rest of our culture, and come to know him even better as a true American hero that can keep teaching us even after the Met's exhibition closes. Thank you.